In the last video, we set up this count variable and we started it off at 0 and that gets rendered to the screen. You then set up some functions that fire when those buttons get clicked, but I told you that it's not worth changing the count because that was going to have no effect on the output. So in this video, we're going to explore why, and we're going to look at how we can re-render the application when the count changes. So let's go ahead and kick things off by adding 1 to the count right here in add 1. We're going to focus on this function together, and you'll be working on these two a little bit later in this video. Right here, what are we going to do? We're just going to set count equal to count plus 1, which is probably what you thought we were going to do, and we can just use the shorthand version count plus plus. Now we can save app.js and test out our brand new application where we do change the count. I'm going to click the +1 button. Down below, we are getting our add 1 message, but you'll notice that the count shown in the browser has not changed. So it must be a problem with our logic. I'm going to go ahead and dump the count to the screen right here. As the second argument to console.log, we will reference the count variable. Now it should be 0 every time because the value isn't changing, but if we click +1, you're going to see that the count is indeed changing. Every time we click the button, we get our add 1 message and we get a new count value. It goes from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4. So everything is working, count is changing, but the application is not re-rendering. So that brings us to our first important point. JSX does not have built-in data binding. To explore why, just take a look at this expression. This expression runs before anything is rendered to the screen. Remember, we don't render a single thing to the screen until we call react-dom.render. So, what do these variables equal before anything is rendered to the screen? Well, we know that these are just static functions, and we know that count equals 0. There's no way one of our button event handlers fired because the buttons haven't even been rendered. So, when we create JSX, all the data that gets used inside of it, that happens at the time the code runs. So in this case, count is always going to be 0 because count was 0 when this first ran. Now, what do we do to fix this? We just rerun this code highlighted here and this code highlighted here when our data changes. Later on, we're going to use React components to do that, but that's getting way ahead of ourselves. I find it's much easier to understand how React works by creating a simple function that just runs both of these again. So we're going to regenerate a new template and we are going to re-render it to the screen. We're going to do that initially when the app first loads, and we're going to do it after we manipulate things like our count. To do that, we're going to make a brand new function down below. We can make a const. We can call this one something like render counter app, and we can set it equal to a function. And this function doesn't need to take any arguments. We're just going to access these 4 variables from the scope they're currently in. And we don't need to rerun this either because this value is not going to change. So all we're going to do is grab template2, cut it out and paste it inside. Then we're going to go ahead and grab our react-dom.render call. We're going to cut that out and paste it inside. And then we can remove all of these empty lines. So I'll leave a single empty line in between. Now at this point, if we save the file, absolutely nothing shows up because we haven't called render counter app. And that is something we want to do when we first kick things off. So right here, I will call it render counter app. And this is what's going to initialize our application. We're going to generate some JSX based off of the application state by default, which is what you see here. We're then going to render it, and that results in our app showing up. Now at this point, clicking count still has no effect. Yes, the count variable is changing, but after it changes, we never re-render. So all we have to do is replace our console.log call with a call to render counter app. We don't need to pass in any arguments because it takes none. And if we save app.js and test this out, we're going to see that things do start working. All of our button clicks cause the count to be incremented. We then generate a new JSX expression with that new count value. We render it to the screen, and the result is our data being updated in real time. So using this simple technique, we're able to illustrate exactly how React does the things it does so well. We're going to be looking at all of those advanced techniques later, but it's important to understand that this is essentially what's happening behind the scenes. So for now, what are we going to do? We're not going to get too ahead of ourselves. All we're going to do is fill out -1 and reset, and filling those out is actually going to be your challenge for the video. So for -1, what are you going to do? You're going to subtract 1 from count, and you're going to re-render. obviously subtract, not subtract. Then we're going to reset things. How are you going to reset things? You can just set count to 0 and re-render. Perfect. So take some time to knock those two out. Once you're done, test things out. You're going to click the -1 button and you should see the count go down. You're going to click the reset button, and no matter where the count is, you should see it set equal to 0. So each of these should have two statements like we have two here. Pause the video, knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, you can click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get it done without too much trouble. I'm going to start with -1 by taking count and setting it equal to count -1, or using the shorthand, count minus minus. Excellent. Next up, we have to re-render. The count data is changing, but it's never going to show up to the screen unless we call render counter app. That is going to trigger a re-rendering of our application, and this is going to allow us to use that -1 button. Let's save app.js and test things out over in the browser. Right here, +1 is still working, which is great, and so is -1. I can go all the way into the negatives by clicking that -1 button a whole bunch of times. Next up is reset. So for reset, we're not going to be incrementing or decrementing. We're just going to be setting it equal to a static value, setting count equal to 0. Now what do? We re-render. So we call render counter app. We can remove the comments, save the file, and test things out. Let's go ahead and see if the reset button works. I'm going to change it to something other than 0. Click reset. It goes to 0. I'm going to go up a little bit, down a couple, reset, and we are still at 0. So there we have it. By creating a function and just calling it in a few separate places after our data changes, we're able to create a little JSX application that has real-time data binding. As that count changes based off of user interaction, we're able to reflect those changes by re-rendering the application. Now, when people first see this basic example and I tell them that it's not too far off from what React actually does in even the most complex applications, they freak out, and rightfully so, because what do they see? They see these two lines running over and over again. What do these two lines do? They regenerate our entire application and they re-render it to the DOM. That seems horribly inefficient, even for the smallest piece of state changing. In this case, a number going up by 1 or down by 1. We have to re-render everything. There's no way that's what's happening. This would never be scalable, and it's not. So React is actually really efficient behind the scenes, and we can get a first-hand look at how efficient it is. To do that, we're going to be using the Elements panel. Now, for this particular example, what I'd like you to do is open up those two divs and open up the H1, and you can make the Elements panel a little bit taller if you need to. I want to make sure I can see all of that. So here I can see my divs opening and closing and everything inside with the H1 expanded. Now right here we have some comments we did not add. These comments are added by React, and it allows it to keep track of the various pieces of text in the H1. There are two distinct parts. We have our static text here, and we have the piece that changes, and React uses these comments to be as efficient as possible when re-rendering. So there's only one thing we need to know about the dev tools before we get started and actually mess around with the UI. It's this: when we change the DOM, whether it is in the Elements panel itself or whether it is via JavaScript, that element is going to flash. So if we double click this +1 text and change it to something like test, you're going to notice that when you hit enter, we get a little flash animation. That lets us know what actually got re-rendered by the browser. Re-rendering is really expensive, so we want to make sure to avoid as much of that as possible. If we change it back to +1, we can see it animates in the other direction. So once again, the button was changed. Now, all of this is going to allow us to see how React re-renders when we interact with the application we just created above. What we're going to do is click one of our buttons, and we're going to watch the Elements panel to see what flashes and keep a close eye on it. So I'm going to click +1 a couple times. What do we see? We see the little flash over this part of the H1. So in the end of the day, when all of this code runs and it regenerates all of our JSX and it seems to just blindly render it to the screen, it is not actually doing that. React is super efficient. So React uses some virtual DOM algorithms in JavaScript to determine the minimal number of changes that need to be made in order to correctly render the new application. In our case, Do the divs need to be wiped out and replaced? Nope. Does the H1 even need to be completely replaced? Nope. Just part of the H1 needs to be replaced. The buttons don't flash at all because the buttons don't change at all. So using React DOM.render, we're actually getting all of the capabilities of React. We're using their virtual DOM algorithm to efficiently render and re-render our application. This is exactly what's going to happen as we explore much more advanced techniques like React components. So let's break this down into practical terms. What does this mean for us? It means that when a single piece of our application state changes, like a number, we can re-render the application, updating it without worrying about slowing down the user or wasting a ton of resources and creating a laggy, buggy application. Instead, the virtual DOM algorithm is going to run behind the scenes. So this runs in JavaScript. The virtual DOM algorithm calculates if any changes need to be made, and if they do, it calculates the minimal number of changes. In this case, just this little guy. The virtual DOM algorithm is much more efficient than just blindly re-rendering. Running a little bit of JavaScript code to see if two things are equal or not is a whole lot faster than running through the process of re-rendering and repainting those pixels to the browser. Remember, we saw what comes back from react.createElement. What comes back is just an object that represents our entire JSX tree. We can use algorithms to compare two objects. That's exactly what React is doing. Now that we have this in place and we know a little bit about how React re-renders, we'll learn more later, we're going to continue on to the rest of the section where we're going to turn our attention away from the counter example and towards the indecision application. There's a lot of work left to do here to create something meaningful, and we're going to dive right in, starting with the next video, which I'm very excited to get to.